right, welcome everyone to the Singapore Pavilion. So we have a program that is starting right now on the role of technology and AI to fast-track decarbonization. So without further ado, let me invite our moderator, Mrs. Maura Hodge, partner KPMG, and our panelists to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Singapore Pavilion and our panel, The Role of Tech and AI to Fast-Track Decarbonization. My name is Maura Hodge, as I was introduced, and I'm a partner at KPMG. I'm the head of our sustainability services in the United States. At KPMG, we offer a global team with a full range of climate strategy, reporting, and assurance services, and it's all underpinned by data and technology, including AI. I'll be your moderator for today's panel, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're about to have. I'll have our panelists introduce themselves in just 1 minute, but first, I would like to thank the Singapore government and the COP30 presidency for hosting us. Our aim today is to empower you to take practical steps to harness the power of technology and AI to accelerate your organization's decarbonization efforts, nature efforts, and understand a little bit more about policy and regulations that can help us move forward too. But one thing we talked about as we were preparing for this panel was the number one thing that is on people's minds when we start talking about AI in the context of sustainability and climate, which is the energy requirements. I recently heard a quote that the cost of intelligence is the cost of energy. And the IEA recently released a study that says by 2030, AI will consume more electricity than the country of Japan. Yet, we've been hearing from CEOs in a global CEO Outlook survey we performed that found that 61% of CEOs still express confidence in meeting their 2030 climate targets, despite the fact that they're all adopting AI right now. So the question is, how is this possible? And what we know is that AI has the power to take data and find ways to be able to help decarbonize, to create energy efficiency. And so one thing I wanted to level set a little bit on is that when we talk about the energy drain from AI, we're typically talking about large language models, or LLMs, right? ChatGPT, Copilot, and that's where a lot of the energy drain is. But there are other ways to use AI, like traditional AI, agentic AI, assistants, that don't use quite as much energy, and they're also really meaningful and impactful and valuable. And so we're going to tease out a little bit all the different types of technology and AI we can use in order to facilitate decarbonization. So with that, what I would love to do is just have our panelists begin to introduce themselves, and we'll jump into the conversation. I'll start with Andy.
Hi, so officially my name is Andromeda Wood. You might notice I'm called Andy most of the time. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Strategy at Workiva, so I spend a disturbing amount of time reading through all the regulation and policy that governments produce, so my colleagues don't have to and we can support our customers properly.
Does AI do that for you now?
It's getting there, but it has a tendency to not pick up the important bits. We're an AI-powered platform that helps companies bring together their sustainability, their finance, and their governance and reporting teams and data. Often to put reports out, but also to manage that data, combine it, and make use of it in good ways.
And my name is Astrid Rusås Christoffersen. I am the Director for Research and Development of DNV. And DNV is a risk management and assurance company. And we do research basically on the green transition as well as the digital transformation. Maybe I should even say the green transformation, because it's really transforming what we're doing. So I'm based in Oslo in Norway.
And I'm Wes Geisenberger with the Hedera Foundation. The Hedera Foundation spends a lot of time, effort, and energy to grow the economy focused on sustainability on Hedera. Hedera is a public network. It's a consortium. So you may be familiar with public blockchains. Hedera is run by these large companies across industries and geographies, like Electricité de France, Google. There's other parties across these industries around the world, including Shinhan Bank, Nomura, and many others. What we do, though, is when we fund these infrastructure and technology capabilities, is we're focused on bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger and sustainability. And what that means is we're focusing on data integrity, environmental integrity, and that focuses on digitizing methodologies most often. Some of those methodologies are used in carbon accounting and decarbonization. Others are used in the carbon markets, biodiversity, or water rights. We're happy to say we work with many institutions and leaders around the world, and our focus is, from an AI perspective, thinking about how can we structure that data so we don't have a garbage in, garbage out, but we can actually add context to the data integrity that is being produced at a granular level.
Great, thanks. Well, let's dive right in, and what I really want to do is get as practical as possible, right? I want like real tangible examples, and I'm going to start with you, Astrid, because I think that you're doing all of this research and development. I'm interested to hear what areas you're focused on and some good examples.
Well, it's easy to start with some industrial AI, which is not really generative AI. And what we do is to make the most out of the renewables. So, for example, how do you get the most out of a solar plant? How do you ensure that they actually are as efficient as your neighbor? So you compare and you use these AI data to compare to see, are you actually optimally using your solar plant? You can also do predictive maintenance to get a forward-leaning advice if something is about to happen that you need to replace. Another example is quite similar on the wind farms. You can optimize how you manage the wind farm, steering the turbines to get more out of your wind farms. Depending on where the wind is blowing and where it comes from, you can have a control of the turbines. So these are very practical examples in how you make more out of your renewables. But these applications are not very risky. You know, if you fail, you lose maybe some efficiency, but there's not any high risk in a critical infrastructure. And that's when you start coming into a different level of using AI. It's when you do that into critical infrastructure where it's actually have a potential to give you some safety risks. For example, in hydrogen production, coming with renewables that have a very alternative electricity, then it exposes your hydrogen for different pressure, your electrolyzers for damage, and you need to balance that well. And that's where we really need to have a risk approach and understanding the uncertainties of AI. The same goes if you go to decarbonization in maritime, for example. You have, for a long distance maritime transportation, you can't use batteries as you do in short sea shipping. You have to go to ammonia or maybe nuclear propulsion, and both of them are quite risky. And with the very difficult to find seafarers these days that are willing to spend a lot of time away from their families, and also with this very high technology efforts that you need for a long-distance shipping, you need a lot more digital surveillance and health monitoring to support the seafarers. And that is extremely important for decarbonization. And that's why we put a lot of effort in understanding how do we make sure that AI is safe and secure. I can come with more examples if you want. I can do fisheries and biodiversity. What do you want?
We'll get there. We'll get there. I'm going to go to Wes next and see what examples you have. And, you know, maybe you'll get a cheer.
So when we think about AI, there's many different types that can be used all across the market. We can look at, in the carbon markets, there's plenty of different uses that we've started working on. One that we're really excited about that we're beginning to work on right now is digitalizing methodologies with AI. And many of the methodologies, especially in the carbon markets, are legacy PDF generated, so by hand. And we see the opportunity to convert them using AI. We've built this very large methodology library. To date, it's open source, it's made in code, it's being used by different parties generating data. But we now see the opportunity to tackle the 400 to 600 methodologies that are out there from the dozens that we've gotten to production state at this point. And we see that as a really critical opportunity because unless the methodologies are in digital, which provide the context for all the data being generated, then we oftentimes can't even think about generating the data because the data is only as good as the methodology defines at that point. Beyond that, though, when we think about pricing of carbon assets, whether it's pricing inside of value chains for emissions reductions for Scope 3, for example, or in carbon markets, what we see is the opportunity to use a specific type of AI and recursive regression machine learning algorithms to price that decarbonization asset. Oftentimes a carbon credit is not just carbon, it's sustainable impact, it is different sustainable development focused goals, community and biodiversity benefits. In biodiversity markets, there are a whole different set of attributes than maybe renewable energy or carbon credits. And if we could predictively price assets that are in flight in value chains or in the carbon markets, what we actually get is a series of outcomes of these attribute certificates that we can then correlate those attributes to a predictive price model. We can build better markets. Now, not everyone is a fan of some of the market approaches, but if we can better price, we can create better predictability on what our investment looks like. And it doesn't have to be carbon markets. It could be tied to MAC curves, where you say, what's the marginal cost of abatement? And how do I want to invest as a company to decarbonize? Those types of opportunities, I think, are relatively, at the surface level right now. We need to get more detail, and that data is rate limited by the methodology, so we're excited to start there, and we're continuing to evolve those investments we've made over the past 5 years.
Yeah, can we dig into that just a little bit more? So you talk about methodology, so can you give us like a specific methodology, and then, where you're doing predictive pricing, but it's based off of something, so what is it based on?
I'm going to break out those into two different areas. So from the methodology digitalization perspective, we work with carbon market standards like Verra, and we've worked with them to make available things like their mangrove methodology. Now, you can do many different things with AI inside that methodology. You can both generate different iterations of data sets that could be used for predictions. You can better take a look at the past trades in the market to predict a price. Those prices have attributes. In machine learning, they're called features. And what we're able to do is say, well, combinations of sustainable development goals, SDGs, we're able to see, are those correlated with a price prediction? Now, we had a series of grants that we've done previously, both with research partners in addition to applications, and we took all the trades back till 2010, and we were able to get to a 94% accurate price prediction on those combinations of sustainable development goals using recursive regression machine learning models to say, well, these series of assets, we can predict the price of the next one that comes to market. So there's only a little bit beyond a dozen of those features that were statistically significant, but we hope in the future that these technologies, as they evolve, as we get more granular data, that we find more statistically significant combinations of attributes or features, and that we're able to better predict going forward using these different AI outcomes. And we haven't even touched on how do we recommend a methodology to a project that maybe doesn't know for the first time in the carbon markets. We haven't talked about those other use cases, but we think those are going to be really good use cases as well.
Great. What about you, Andy?
Yeah, so in many ways, I've kind of gotten a slightly easier job because we've already had seriously operational AI that is literally doing the work of making energy more efficient, wrangling biodiversity data, which I really want us to get onto later. We've got market AI doing a lot of very complicated wrangling out in the carbon markets. We're way more, I could almost say boring and direct, but basically we help companies deal with their internal data, finance data, sustainability data, the data that comes from their operations and that they need to wrangle into knowing what their emissions are at the moment, helping set transition targets, looking at what impacts they're having, understanding the scope of those impacts, understanding the financial impact of those, so that fundamentally they're in a position to do things like report to their investors in the outside world and perform other transparency and disclosure actions, but also manage their corporate performance. Now, that might not sound like very direct decarbonisation, but there's a couple of ways there. One is obviously just the classic. If a corporation is gathering and understanding and reporting on its emission data and everything else it's doing, pulling together its different aspects of operations, then it's in a much better position to, for example, know how many carbon credits it might need to buy. It's also moving money in the capital markets to say this is a green direction, this is not a green direction. But really the actual fundamental key to it all is actually getting boring jobs done that are in the way of decarbonisation. There's an awful lot of manual data analysis, manual work, messing about with Excel sheets, trying to manually fix data sources that have all come in different formats, non-automated work that has people sitting down for days and days and days at a time and not doing anything else. And one of the things we consistently hear from across the markets and large numbers of sustainability professionals is whilst there's an acknowledgement that things like transparency are important, there's also a really big pushback right now against red tape, against admin jobs that are stopping companies from operating as companies, but also stopping them from getting things done. And very specifically, there's been a strong pushback of, I'm taking more time doing my reporting. I'm not taking as much time and effort to be able to actually go out and do all these efficiency projects and make the impacts. And yes, automation and AI, it's a pretty good way of getting boring admin jobs out of the way, trust me.
I think that's a good point. And every example I feel like that we've heard here is we're trying to make the job easier. And previously, before I worked at the Hedera Foundations with Oracle for 6 years, spending a lot of time on AI applications. AI generally is lowering the cost of prediction for those who just think about it when taking a step back. And if we can find ways to lower the cost of what is the answer that I need, how do I get my report into a standard, whether it's a carbon market standard or it's for a disclosure, hopefully AI is just something we don't talk about, and I'm getting a recommendation in the future to make sure it's correct.
But what are some of the ways that you are actually helping to promote that, right? And to allow business to be able to do the work as opposed to spend the time and the money on reporting?
So when we're thinking about generative data sets, some of those data sets are thinking at a prediction level. How do I plan for a project? And so in the carbon markets, when you create a project description document, you have to sometimes do 40 years of projections. Those projections are big Excel sheets in the past. There's still going to be Excel sheets when they're submitted, but oftentimes that data can be generated, tested. We can even use agents to process that, predict if it's going to be correct. You're still going to need to do manual review. It doesn't replace human data integrity checks. There's context that needs to be sure it's correct, and in compliance, when it comes to emissions reporting, somebody is on the hook for that. You do not want to be reporting in a disclosure without AI being checked by a human. But if you can spend half the amount of time, a quarter of the amount of time generating that data, it means the cost of traditionally a $500,000 investment in a project description document in the carbon market is now much more accessible for a community who's working with a consultant or a project developer. It also means that when you're going to check that as an auditor, we have a good example. Gold Standard has a methodology pilot program, and one of the project developers submitting is called ATEC. They're an Australian company, but their projects are in Bangladesh. They're generating metered energy cooking device-based measurements. That means there's volumes of data that cannot be checked manually. AI is a really good tool to say, well, not just pulling a sample, but can I pre-check that before it goes to an auditor to make sure that I'm not getting an error? If you ask someone to do that manually, it will take years when it really should be taking days or less than a month. That same level of rigor can now be applied in emissions reporting as well. If you look at data from that's submitted in the EU, you have kind of three options. You have an estimate, you have direct and continuous monitoring, or ad hoc data submissions. Now, most folks, when given the choice, are going to take estimates in the past. But going forward, where we start to take a step upwards in the requirements, we're going to need tools like AI to better detect anomalies. And I'm sure, Astrid, you have some good examples of what that looks like. So maybe I'll pass the mic over to you.
Maybe I can just step back a little bit, because we're talking about so many different AIs, and I'm not sure if everyone is following. Because we have what we call more traditional AI, which is machine learning, or you learn from pictures and sensors, and that's been going on for quite some time in the industry. You can learn about the optimized efficiencies, or you can learn how you detect corrosion, for example, or a deformation from your learning data. But now, recently, over the past year, maybe, we've been talking a lot more on generative AI. And that's where you using your chatbots or your ChatGPT, and you generate text or you generate something else. To begin with, when that came, I thought this was not applicable for industrial application. That's what I thought. But I'm totally wrong. Because now you can see people using large language models to ask for very specific things that are in, let's say they will ask for how thick do my pipeline needs to be, or the thickness of the steel. And they ask these things. Or they can ask, how do I do pigging in my pipeline? And for some of you, maybe that work with pipelines, know that a pig in a pipeline is not an animal. It is, there's something that cleans the pipe. And when you don't have the context, you get totally incorrect answers. And that is happening all the time. So even generative AI has a lot of risk. I'm sure you tried to ask the question several times and you get different answers. It's not predictable. You don't know what to get. You know what? I saw someone trying to have a picture of themselves, and they asked the generative AI to make a similar picture. And they got slightly different. And then they asked again, make a similar picture of this newly generated picture. And it's slightly different. And you do that repeatedly several times. You are looking totally different. So generative AI is actually not, you can't really trust it. I'm not sure you know this. And I want to give tribute to the Singapore, actually, because they have this AI verification foundation where the tech companies are coming together to make test tools and share how uncertain or not accurate these models are. And I think it's very important for us to understand that, because it's used tremendously in the industry, as well as when you do the chatbots. Then we have agentic AI. And agentic AI is something that last year people talk a lot about. I was at the Gartner conference previously this week, and they talked about agentic AI all the time. And that is different because you give the AI a goal. You just don't give them a task, but you say, order this ticket for me, or buy a blue hat, the cheapest one that you find. You see? So it gives the AI agency. And then we're talking about embodied AI. That's robotics, like drones or robots. It could even be a ship that is autonomous. It's something that has a body. And all of these have very different natures. But it's actually how you use it, in what context you're using it, what is defining the risk. And that's where we go into policy.
Oh, we will so get to policy. I just wanted to say, obviously, you asked a slightly joking question about whether the LLMs were helping with my job. And the interesting, most of the time, they're not actually. And there's a reason for that. If you are asking about especially a brand new regulation or a brand new piece of policy, it's a reasonably, firstly, it's in lawyer language. So a general LLM has some issues to start with. But then it's often on something that's a new concept, or it's in a new field, or it's not something fundamentally that is statistically in the main background of the statistical model yet. But that's one of the reasons that we see a lot of work going into more specialized AIs, where they have been given very specific foundations in specific fields of knowledge. So that's when you say, well, hang on a minute, if I tell you about accounting, you will at least be able to understand some of the slightly weird bits that are in accounting. And across the board, as we studied, let's train up an AI that has a different statistical base that is more appropriate for what it's trying to do. It will still periodically get things wrong, because the clue's in the bit where we call them generative. They happily generate based on what's statistically likely, not necessarily on whether that's actually the answer. But the more we have this basis for these AIs that say, right, I know what a set of accounts look like, the higher the chances are that we actually get good data out of them. But also context. In the world that I'm working in, within that corporate data, it might not seem as complicated as some of the technical language that we're talking about here within, details of pigs and pipes. But there's still, even in some of the most apparently simple financial statements that a company puts out in a really boring annual report has a massive amount of context that is not visible to a reader of that report. They make assumptions all over the place that humans know how to read because we know what's supposed to be in there, and we have that context. So there's a whole heap of work going on there, and that's where the verification work becomes so interesting, and we get into audit and assurance and a ton of stuff I'm probably getting ahead of.
One thing I think that's important, though, when we get to those numbers at the end, they come from a methodology, whether it's a financial report and a financial methodology, or in carbon, a carbon methodology. The hard part, though, is trusting the number when it comes to carbon, because as we've developed over time, the science matures. I think what's really important is when we're trusting those numbers, that we think about, do those numbers have an audit associated with them? Are they collected in the context of a methodology? Is it a current methodology? What we've done is we built a rules engine for methodologies that helps give AI the context, and we can break it down from a standard to a methodology to forms, workflows, parameters, or calculations that then link to that unit. And I think that's the important part, is if you don't train the AI to understand beyond the unit that's reported to the calculation, the workflow, that workflow should include an independent audit, even if that audit's using its own machine learning techniques to do the audit, we can't trust the data. And if that data doesn't come from an independent attestation, whether it's a mix of sensor, people, systems, in the carbon satellite data, there's other data sources in emissions tracking that could be continuous monitoring, we're going to have a really hard time trusting environmentally driven units of account, whether it's for emissions reporting, biodiversity, or carbon. And the AI opportunity, I would argue, is more so in the context than it is in the reports itself.
You all are speaking my heart language, so thank you. My background is as an auditor. I've been an auditor for 20 years and have been doing sustainability assurance for 15. So having this conversation makes me so happy, because this is what the drum I've been beating over and over again. And it is just hard to get everybody to understand the level of detail that's necessary to support the information, the methodologies that are required to make sure that they're accurate. But you are right. We've invested heavily at KPMG to use AI to do our own assurance and audit work, but it is absolutely not a substitute for somebody coming in and making sure that everything is structured properly, that you are following the rules. And I think sustainability, greenhouse gas data is yet to come, right? We can do it for financial information because we've had financial statements for hundreds of years. As the methodologies continue to evolve and change around greenhouse gas and other non-financial metrics, it's a little bit harder, but it is definitely an area that we need to continue to progress, because my strong belief is that non-financial data needs to be on par with financial data to be able to make good decisions and to be able to move forward. But Wes, one thing you had mentioned before was just how you're thinking about financing some of these things and help.
What am I going to do with this new regime in CBAM? What am I going to do with the new laws coming in California? How do I get to assurance requirements? Our goal at the foundation at the Hedera Foundation, is to think, well, with this open source infrastructure, that's all freely available. Any application in the world, any company, startup, can go use our open source infrastructure. It's called the Hedera Guardian. It's out there on GitHub, and digitize the methodology. But we've spent time, millions of dollars over half a decade to make this possible. Well, how do we make sure that that investment is going to be used by companies, and those companies are thinking about, what systems do I want today? Our goal is to think, well, how do we scale the carbon markets now? One of our thought processes is, well, these software companies are going to take time to implement. Maybe it's a half a year, maybe it's a year. It's going to take a while to change their value chains. What can we do to accelerate the market now? And one of the concepts that we're looking at is, well, what can we do to engage with corporates so that as they're thinking about buying carbon credits, and some of the most active sustainability-focused corporations are investing not just in their own value chains, but the carbon markets. So, well, maybe if we said to the companies, we'll help fund that. We'll help fund the part that's going to the software companies, to the auditors, to the implementations, what could we do to say, well, if you invest in sustainability now, we're going to help you with the technology. We're going to partner up with folks like Workiva, auditors, whether it's KPMG, DNV, or other parties. How do we get this implemented and at the same time enable decarbonization that's happened or is happening in the real world? That's a concept we're inviting everyone to come talk to us. How can we get this outcome together? And we want to see how we can accelerate now. You know, one of the themes of COP is implementation, and I challenge everyone to think, what can we do so that a dollar in the community, dollar going to a community, can also go into a value chain? How do we find the creative financial systems where we're aligning corporate and community interests to get to a global outcome?
I think that's really innovative. So I know we also wanted to talk a bit about nature too. Decarbonization and climate, you know, sort of have taken up a lot of the agenda, but we've spent a lot of time talking about nature here at COP too. So maybe some practical examples of how AI and tech can help us protect nature and conserve more. And
Okay, you were. Yes, in nature, you know, especially in the ocean, there's so much not researched how we actually understand biodiversity and how the climate, the heating of our seas, is impacting the sea. And I think that really needs to come together. And we need to measure, we need to collect data, and we have an opportunity to use AI to see patterns in a new way. And there's new technologies in this space also that called eDNA, where you can actually take DNA samples of the ocean. I think ocean is very important. I think land is also important, but the ocean is much more crowded these days because we have a lot more transportation on ship. We have a lot of offshore wind. We have a need to expand aquaculture because we need sustainable proteins, and we also have a lot of tourism offshore. And at the same time as this is carrying a lot of load on our ocean, we need to protect the ocean at the same time. And with climate change coming in and heating it up, there's a lot of challenges. So we think that a lot of research is still needed to really understand this. And also to put, like we have carbon credits, we need nature credits also for the ocean and land to be able that we protect our oceans and understand biodiversity. So how can we make these industries actually coexist and make them coexist together while protecting our oceans? In biology, there's a lot of opportunities as well in healthcare, obviously. Using AI, you can understand your personalized medicine can be developed. So there's a lot of opportunities just having this AI. But everything that I'm talking about now, if it's done wrong, if we get the hallucinations that you get from generative AI today, it's not working, right? You don't want that for your medicine. And you don't want that for your oceans or your land either. So we need also to invest in understanding how does actually AI work. A lot of researchers don't understand it themselves. So we need more research in understanding how can we test and how can we understand the risks that we're exposed to when using AI. And I want to, if you want to go on online and see a very good researcher that is explaining what this is all about. It's Joshua Benjo, and he's explaining very, very well why we need to invest more in safe and secure AI.
Although in more positive news, actually I was just going to say that sometimes I kind of feel like we're on a panel about decarbonization, and I would be willing to bet there's at least some people, even with the theme of this COP, wondering what nature's got to do with decarbonization. And yes, I mean, one of the good things is the number of sessions I've been sitting in where there have been people going through in extreme detail about some of the connections. But, and I'm going to mention reporting once, but it's to make a point so that I can get off reporting again, I promise, which is that when they were developing the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, they built all the topics at once, and that included the reporting for the biodiversity topic. And then they got a lot of feedback from companies that certain things were going to be harder than others for them to implement. So could they have a bit more time, or could they have, proportionality put into those? And the whole topic, there was the one whole topic that everybody got back and said we can't do it, was biodiversity. And there was a challenge to it. It is obviously, basically, we're talking about the systems and the complexity of how our planet works. But that's one of the main reasons why decarbonisation and nature and biodiversity are actually linked. And fundamentally, at the very basic level, everybody, I think, has pretty much got the idea that trees build themselves out of carbon, and they're a very good way of eating a lot of it. So are peat bogs, because they don't break down. They just store carbon forever. Those environments only function well if they are full, active, complete ecosystems. So the trees don't work on their own. If you plant a field of a monoculture of a specific type of tree, it will temporarily eat up a lot of carbon, but it won't do it to the most maximal way, and it won't maintain itself. It will have to have humans maintaining its existence for the rest of the time that we want that field of trees to continue to act as a carbon sink. Bogs are exactly the same. At the moment in the UK, we have massive areas of peatland that we maintain as humans, because the bits of the ecosystem that would maintain them in that state naturally don't exist anymore. We got rid of the top predators, as it happens. The UK really doesn't have any big top predators anymore. So there is a pretty fundamental link between that biodiversity and the decarbonisation. And nature credits and carbon credits, there's no particular reason why there shouldn't be just credits that are actually maintaining natural environments in order to make sure that they are decarbonising. So there's that side of things. And then, of course, there's just AI and the sheer complexity of the massive amounts of data that it takes to monitor such a complex system.
And I just wanted to say, where it's easy to talk about trees because we see them, but the ocean has trees, it's a seaweed that we need in the ocean, and they're gone too. So they're not protecting the habitat in the ocean. And we need to know what's going on, and we need to plant them and plant seaweed as we plant trees.
I would just say, you mentioned something really important where we've gotten rid of the top predators, but oftentimes humans are in that value chain too. And we need to find the right incentives. The reason why the predators are there is there's a whole ecosystem that they can live in. Humans as well are looking to maintain farms, agriculture, and what we can do is also think about the incentive alignment. So we've made some investments in that, and one that we recently announced was with Fair Food International. So we gave a grant to look at how can we support farmers getting an uplift in their pay, fair wages, because at the end of the day, those farmers, if they're looking at different types of no-till farming, different practices that are participating in value chains, those value chains very much touch biodiversity. They very much touch carbon. Oftentimes they have to think about, especially in Global South context, clean cooking. They're all tied in. There could be clean cooking related credits. There could be agricultural credits for carbon. There could be biodiversity benefits that touch those ecosystems. And so when we say, well, peat bogs aren't being maintained, there are ways that we can incentivize that. And the UK has done a good job with some of the recent legislation, investment initiatives that are out there. But we have to also think about what are the incentive systems that exist to make this possible. And I would argue that there's a social side to that we really need to think about, and how do we build an ecosystem that's not just working with biodiversity, but the stewards of biodiversity in that crediting mechanism.
But just to bring it back to AI, because we're drifting a bit, all of this is unbelievable amounts of data. So I promise we're still talking about AI and technology, because there's no way we're going to do some of this without those technological advances.
Can you give us some examples of the type of data that's currently being collected around, that will be helpful around nature and biodiversity?
Well, I mean, do you want to do the ocean one, an ocean one, or? Well, I'm going to just borrow somebody else's presentation that I watched yesterday, shamelessly, because it was very cool. Which was and it's also extremely topical, which is a scientific project that's been running in the Amazon for quite a long time now, which has been testing the impact of elevated levels of CO2 on the forest itself. Because the forest, we need to know fundamentally if global warming is going to kill our biggest carbon sink and turn it into a carbon emitter. It's a pretty key thing to know. But they've been running that experiment for 10 years. They have 10 years worth of constant hourly measurements of the impact of CO2, on, I might be making hourly up, on trees. It's an unbelievable amount of data. Nature has a tendency to produce this kind of vast quantity of data.
Well, I think we can touch a little bit of aquaculture, because we know that aquaculture is also has a lot of the depth on the ocean, but also on fish health is extremely important. Sea lice is a challenge, gills is hurt, and there's a lot of fish health challenges. So I think AI is also used to count sea lice. And we can do machine learning and understand and see pictures and have a better understanding how the nature and the fish health is impacting each other and how we can optimize that.
I'm just going to go back to the example that we started with on thinking about the attributes and features in projects. Well, those attributes and features aren't just tied to carbon, they're not just tied to nature, they're tied to the incentives. Is this more likely to have a higher crop yield? Could be a feature. Is this action specifically? If we're thinking about permaculture, is this going to lead to better carbon storage? Can I fetch a better price, better credit generation in an agricultural setting? If you say, well, how do we get there? That social impact feature could be, well, if I uplift the pay of a farmer in that setting, am I more likely to see a higher rate of permanency, or durability on that project? Those little features that we talk about from a machine learning setting or an AI prediction model, what prices it's going to yield, are really important. But fundamentally, AI is just lowering the cost of the prediction. From our perspective, when we go to use parts of that methodology to say, hey, we're going to register this project, if it's a carbon project, under CCB, which is a specific standard under Vera, community and biodiversity focused feature, could be part of that. It could be part of a methodology. It could be part of a project design and module that fetches a better price, but also in project design says we should do this because it's going to lead to a better value chain outcome. Oftentimes carbon projects are sitting inside of value chains. They could be insets, they could be carbon credits. And AI makes it easier to work on both the design, but also the predictive outcome within a value chain that these ecosystems sit in.
Well, I promised Andy that we will get to regulation and policy, but I do actually want to open up the floor and see if you all have any questions. I know we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the merits and the risks of AI. We've talked about how it can accelerate decarbonization, how it ties into nature, but any questions?
Thanks, Maury. Can you hear me? Hey, Wes, good to see you again. I think you covered broad decarbonisation, nature, but the other area that I'm particularly interested in is circularity, product decarbonisation. And I actually think AI is going to unlock that like we've never seen before. And we're entering into a world where I think there's now greater appreciation of circularity. I live in Europe, where we've made circularity absolutely a central theme. And if you really get behind what circularity is really about data and the data that goes into products, how you can do it, how you can build better solutions, better products. Would you agree with my thesis, at least, that AI is going to revolutionize how we think about circularity?
So I would say that AI in combination with other technologies. So let's think about tracking a product through its life cycle. You probably are going to want to look at a product carbon footprint. Every product carbon footprint probably is going to have a different methodology, but you're going to want to understand, well, how does that relate to the allocation from a corporate inventory? You're probably going to generatively want to create a methodology with all the attributes of that product, not just emissions data. There could be nature data, deforestation data. You're going to have to think about how is that immutable, because it's a massive coordination problem across countries, companies, geographies, regulatory jurisdictions. I would argue blockchain is just as important, if not more important, because if these assets are going to be tracked, whether they're commodities or non-financial assets like emissions profiles, I would argue blockchain is going to lower the cost of trust of that information, because we don't want to just think about the unit. A token's great, but if a token doesn't have context, if an integer, which could be a set of emissions embodied in a product, is just an integer, we have a problem. we need to likely evolve from some of the Pathfinder framework good first steps into a way that I can trust that number, I can trust that product footprint, and I would argue that that's an asset that's tokenized, where the methodology and data are linked, so that when I pass that product forward, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, company to company, that I can understand, not with a prediction, actually not with AI, but with certainty, with assurance level rigor, that this is in fact the right carbon footprint. I can follow an allocation company to company. I could carry an audit forward intra-company accounting wise. I can say this came from the correct factory. I can then, when I pass it to a new company, they can trust the audit. Maybe it's KPMG does the audit in one place, Deloitte does it in another, and down a value chain we can track audit to audit. Maybe DNV does it after that. I think that that is a really important element that we really haven't explored as an industry as much as we should. And when we get to circularity at the end of that cycle, AI can check each step of the way to predict that it's been correct. But at the end of the day, we need the immutable, assured level of information that today doesn't exist. And if we want to get to these regulatory statutes that we have in mind, where we get to limited and then reasonable assurance, we got to figure that out.
And as you probably know, Wes, in Europe, we're moving to a system of a digital product passport where all of this is going to be hugely relevant.
So we've spent a lot of time on that use case in the Hedera ecosystem. It's one of the largest use cases we've done to date. We think that that product passport needs to be composable. It can't just be an item. It needs to carry all of these attributes. And one of the big efforts we're going to be doing over the next 6 months is being able to feed audit trails of data tied to that product passport through a series of methodologies, not just one, but multiple methodologies acting as a sleeve to the data that's being generated. We haven't really thought about this, I think, globally as well. How do I make sure that that same immutable data point is not just fitting in an inset or a carbon crediting program, but also meeting EUDR, meeting these other regulatory frameworks for disclosure? I think that's one of the big unlocks that we get to help unlock CSRD, unlock some of the different regulatory statutes that maybe folks think are too hard today. And to my point of making it easier, we have to make the regulations easier to achieve. AI can be part of that, but I think blockchain is just as big. And public ledgers like Hedera and the Hedera Guardian as a tool set can really be an enabler in lowering the cost of trust.
Thanks for bringing that up. I've wondered where blockchain went. It was a huge conversation 5 years ago, and then it just kind of fell out. And so I think that's a really great application.
I mean, we're definitely drifting in the direction of my world here. I think, so the circularity is a really good example of one of those areas where the accumulation of information gets quite large quite quickly, but also where it needs to be turned into something that continues to be audited all the way to the end of a life cycle that is literally, so a set of ratings on an item of clothing. There's a company I buy clothes from that gives me this lovely little report of about 12 indicators that tell me a lot about where that item of clothing comes from. But at the moment, quite a few of their indicators have little notes on them that say, this might be based on estimates, or this is, we know roughly, but we don't have the exact detail for this yet. And product passports, I think, are a really good example of that. But we also have to track things all the way back round, and then they keep building this history that's just going to get ridiculous. And for companies at the moment who are struggling with just the level of data they need to do, carbon reporting or at least greenhouse gas reporting, it starts to get a bit daunting. And we get into this world of, well, we've kind of dropped people with the need to be transparent on some of this before they're feeling really comfortable and confident that they understand and they know the data and they can source the data, and that the auditors can come in and assure the data. Because for all of these, when we get into regulatory requirement world and my world where it's a policy, whether it's an annual report, a sustainability report, a product passport, whatever that output is that is going to go and be looked at by somebody, if you're a corporation or even me as a person, I want to be confident that I know that I've just said the right thing. And if I can't go back and get the audit trail, I'm in trouble. And this is well beyond just an AI problem. This is just a broad technology problem across the board.
And I'd argue if that methodology that data was collected under isn't immutable, it's going to be really hard. If that audit, that not just the end stamp of approval, but some of the checks that went through isn't immutable, it's going to be even harder. Because how do you trust the audit before yours? If you're an auditor today, you're not can you just go ahead and look back and trust the audit, or look forward and trust the audit? That's going to be something that's maybe one of the auditors on stage wants to talk about, but I
Well,
think
no,
that's
I mean,
hard.
only if the methodology doesn't change, right? That's their
Yeah.
biggest challenge today is that you can make up your own methodologies these days. We call it internal criteria, and we can assure against that, right? But then it puts it on the reader and the user of the information to understand what the methodology is, and then make that moral decision as to whether or not it's right, it's accurate, it's the information that you want. And so,
Non-GAAP measures of the sustainability world.
any
But
other
what about LCA on data centers and AI itself? We don't understand that, do we?
I'm curious, one of the fundamental building blocks of being able to do any of this stuff with machine learning or AI is good data, right? You mentioned you start with a certain amount of data, you eventually get some sort of degradation, but it ultimately comes in with like what quality of data do you have, whether it's about carbon credits or it's about project development or it's about sourcing, where you get your materials from and your supply chain. How do you, what technologies are you seeing or what advancements are you seeing to get the on-the-ground data that then feeds into some of these higher-level abstractions? Because I think we talk a lot about what do we do and how do we analyze the information, but the reality is that the information doesn't exist in many cases.
So there's a few things to unpack there. I think that's important. One, you have to also think about the AI integrity in itself, and we've made a couple investments. One is in a company called Equity Labs, EQTY, and they're looking at actually how the AI itself has been trained for integrity, what steps and checks according to the different AI regulations exist. So I'm going to park that for now because that's a whole different conversation. But when it comes to looking at the data integrity itself, sources are going to be very different. We've made investments in the carbon credit space into eddy covariance technologies, where we can actually deploy sensors in the forest to support crediting methodologies, say like RED Plus or agroforestry, where we can provide better sensorized information of the respiration of the forest over time compared to the atmospheric measurements that are happening. Beyond that, we're thinking about, well, how is that data going to be trusted from a chip to a public ledger, not getting processed in the cloud in between, but actually making sure that that's immutable. As these data volumes increase, we see this being a growing problem because the checks that are going to be required are going to have to be more agentic, more automated, more predictive. So there's a project by Dell called Project Alvarium that looks at device to server connection and data integrity, and there's annotations along the way, and I definitely would encourage folks to check that out. The company we made an investment in is called Demia, that is taking that technology, which Dell made open source, and applying it in the Hedera Guardian context. So if we have an edge IoT data device, we can actually trace that onto the public ledger from source to system into the context of a methodology to the unit of measure. And that's something that we see as something that's going to be more important over time, but that's not just important for carbon credits. That's probably likely much more important in value chains, industrial settings, where we don't know if a sensor is going to be misbehaving, not intentionally per se, but just because there may be miscalibration, there could be version changes, firmware changes. We probably all have gone through device updates, for every single device that's probably sitting in our pocket or in our work settings. And I would argue that we need to think about those types of data elements where blockchain can be immutable, lower the cost of trust. AI can lower the cost of prediction, but IoT is going to lower the cost of monitoring as we want to be more precise going into the future.
Well, very dependent on the application, but there's a lot of research and use also in what we call synthetic data. So you generate the data yourself, basically, if you don't have any data, or you generate data to add to your limited data spaces. Because usually if you want to understand if your application or system is sufficiently safe, you need quite a lot of data or experience. And a lot of new things that we put in place doesn't have experience because it's new. And we just learn from experience. That's what AI do. It's just learning from what happened before. It's just the previous pattern. But when you doing autonomy or a totally new thing, you don't have the experience, and that is a challenge. So you could generate data by doing simulations that you do with deterministic simulations, like old school way of doing engineering. And then you can add that to your data that you learn when you're in operation. And by combining them, you get a better data space and then a better understanding of uncertainty and accuracy of your system.
I'm actually going to bring us back to some of the basics, actually, and what I think is some low-hanging fruit, because I think a lot of the reason we don't have the data is because it's not collected at the source. So I always go with greenhouse gas inventories. You need the kilowatt hours of energy for your Scope 2 data, right? You're getting an invoice, and you're getting information from your power company about how much energy or how many kilowatt hours you're using on a monthly basis. But instead of inserting that into your ERP system like SAP or Oracle, all you do is the dollars. Add the kilowatt hours. And I think finally the ERP systems have realized that this is a part of it. Same thing with supply chain information. You're collecting all of this data about your suppliers. What are those data elements that you actually really need to be collecting up front and creating then the boxes to do it and the new reports that you need to run? I make it sound so simple, and I know that it's not, but also I feel like people just aren't thinking about it, and to me, that's where the low-hanging fruit is.
Well, that, and in fact, you've got a lot of this data already, but it's, I think one of the big issues we see with customers is they have it, but not in a structured way or a controlled way or an auditable way. So that is another thing, is a lot of companies are, obviously, they're already doing the best they possibly can to manage their operations, which means operational data is being collected. Now, there are always gaps, you know, sometimes we want to know exactly which field our strawberries came from, but I've seen that from a couple of places now. It's like, it was that field over there. We monitor it by satellite. So we're getting much, much better at collecting the data operationally, and the thing that we're, I think, still struggling to do is have it in systems that keep it in an ordered, structured, auditable, assured way, all the way from operations to whatever function it is that you need it to be right for.
You have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. We've talked about the advantage of AI in fast-tracking decarbonization, but my question is actually when we look to Africa, you know, the countries in Africa or organizations in Africa, so they can't afford, you know, to integrate, you know, the AI in, you know, their, let's say, organization. So I would like to ask, so what kind of incentive and mechanism can be done to help also, you know, organization in global south to also integrate this technology? So yeah.
So there's a bunch of different opportunities, and you know, I really want to applaud the government of Uganda. A few days ago, launched the platform called Pearl Carbon, and it's to help different carbon projects within Uganda access the market. And they actually use AI in this platform in addition to blockchain technology. The company they work with, called Evercity, actually has helped enable them to use AI to help generate project description document data, and it's helping predict what the answer should be relative to what they're putting in. And so one of the hardest things in carbon is to understand the methodology. Sometimes they're like 100 to 400 pages. The reports that you have to generate are 40-year predictive models in some cases for agroforestry methodologies. And it's a very daunting task if you're a farmer or a collection of farmers that are for the first time trying to access carbon-based finance. And so they use AI as a way to better understand if they're going down the right track and make recommendations from a project idea note stage to a project registration stage. And that's just one part of it. The next stage is to build a cash flow model so the project's investable, to make sure that they can then go access institutional finance if they get an agreement to purchase the credits in the future, or an offtake agreement with, say, pay upon delivery. And these are some of the ways that AI, we see at least, is helping countries, especially in Africa. We've seen others, the mangrove methodology, the first submission was actually in Senegal, in the Séné-Saloum Delta, as well as Casamance. And those communities oftentimes are trying to figure out how do I get this data across, this project specifically is 7,500 hectares that has gone through planting, and they're saying, well, across a series of communities, how do I make sure this data is correct? And a project developer by the name of Alcott, who was just recently acquired by CarbonX, is enabling these communities using some of the AI technology to better do the predictive models across 4 different project planting sites. And so I would say AI can be done in conjunction with communities. It can be done by governments to help create platforms to make the market accessibility easier. But there's plenty of other use cases I think that should be explored. And you know, there's quite a few different opportunities to make life a little bit easier, to the point earlier.
It's also, I think governments is key for me. I mean, we have examples from countries around the world where projects roll out more quickly when the government provides a simple piece of software for free in some way. You know, we sell, obviously, something that is large and complicated and primarily for larger organizations and larger companies. But I was on a panel earlier this week where we were talking about helping SMEs who also, they're not going to be able to afford to splash out on large software tools. And a lot of it does come down to sort of 2 things, and one of which is back to one of our earlier topics. The first one is standardization. If it is a standard set of information that's being asked for, then it is a much simpler job to do. It does not need the sophisticated technology at the end user. The end user can do something more simple, and the technology can do the complicated thing up here. And then the other one is governments really can make a big difference by it just having these simple tools available that collect and verify and make it easier to just type something in, basically.
On that point, AI doesn't necessarily mean you need to be an expert in AI. If you pull an Excel sheet down in our system and you push it back up, that can be reviewed by an AI tool. You may just need to be the expert in beginning that process and using AI as a tool. You don't have to be the developer of it to make it work for you. And I think that's an important point, that some of these tools already are built in the tools that we're used to, not necessarily requiring expertise for every single user. And I think that's probably one of the more important points that we need to take a step back on when it comes to emerging technology.
Thanks for that question. So let's get into regulation and policy. I think we were already sort of tiptoeing around it. So we can talk about it both around AI as well as around reporting, as well as around decarbonization. So let's, whatever direction you want to take it in, I think they all kind of come together. I think maybe Astrid, if you want to start, because I know you have some.
Very often, you know, people are trying to say, okay, the balancing innovation and regulation. You know, we can't have innovation if we regulate so much and so on. And I have to say that, you know, AI is today a power game. You know, it's first mover. That's what people think will get it all, and it's a part of the geopolitical play, right? And I am afraid that push to get that power is someone want to cut corners. And the ones that will be hurt because it's cut corners are democracies, because of what is truth. It's AI used in safety critical applications that are not tested, not known how it works. It has the potential to really change our societies. So I think that regulation, we can talk about how it's regulated and but I think regulation protects people, and it protects the people that are vulnerable. So to me, just to use an AI and you don't know exactly, you have no idea how it works, and you're just using it, I think it's actually quite harmful. We need to stand up for protecting. And to me, you know, decarbonization, CO2, climate change is really, really important. But I think the next wave that we need to look up for is also how AI is used. We have now, we're working with tidying up for our first industrial revolution, and now we get a second industrial revolution. Let's use this tool for good and not to destroy more, because a powerful tool can be used both ways. So that's why I think we should argue for regulation and policies. We can talk about how they should be, but just removing them because it's taking away innovation, it's not true. It's like saying, I want a nuclear plant without any safety measures. Do you really want that? We don't want that because we understand that risk, but people don't really grasp the risk of use of AI and how it's going to impact societies. And then I just have to say also the EU AI Act comes, you know, but EU AI Act is strict on something that is illegal, which is if you want to sell a product that is surveying you and controlling you and seeing what you're doing and give you points if you're behaving well or so, it's not for sale in the EU because it's illegal, and I'm happy about that. If it's not any risk, there's no regulation. You just have to tell AI is used. But if it's high risk, then you need to have transparency. You need to understand how it's impacting that risky application that it's used for. And I think that's a good thing. So next time is someone saying, asking you this, I always go, okay, do you really want autonomous cars or ships without knowing how it works? Do you want that? Do you want that the insurance companies can just say no to you without giving any reason? Is that what you want? You know, I think we need to go into details what this actually means to our societies.
Regulation, and there's a very interesting point about regulation and innovation. It was a point that was made quite a while ago that regulation actually has a tendency to follow the markets. It doesn't tend to be ahead of them. And in particular in a space like AI and technology, the technology is almost always moving faster than the regulation itself is. It tends to be sort of reactive of saying as innovation has happened, it has exposed risks. Putting something into practice means that we have a much better understanding of where the risks are and where the opportunities are. And then regulation has a tendency to follow from that and say, oh, hang on a minute, now this is what we're going to do to try and address those risks. And people have a lot of opinions about how strong it should be, what level of risk is the appropriate level of risk, how much regulation there should be. It's a big global topic right now. I don't really need to go into it. But fundamentally, that is a balance that's being looked for all the time, is what level of risk is the point at which we need to introduce something to regulate. But there is the other way regulation can help, which is in standardization. And the voluntary, for example, and I have to use a reporting example because it's actually one of the easiest right now. Although I think carbon methodologies is probably another space where we can talk about this. There were so many sustainability reporting frameworks. I mean, so many. And quite a lot of frameworks that weren't about reporting, but we're going to end up in a company having had to talk about it at some point in a report somewhere. And I think exactly how standardized it should be, who should standardize it, is going to take a bit of time, but the International Sustainability Standards Board is going to, it's being adopted in countries like Singapore, it's been adopted across the Asia-Pacific region, it's being adopted across all sorts of other regions. Having a common baseline of that data doesn't just help or mean that the big companies that are reporting under it put out more standardized data. It means the data that's being requested down the value chain and being used in other areas is also more standardized. And that's another area where regulation and policy can make a big difference, is to just say, look, let's just decide we're all going to be using the same data to make our decisions, please, because that can make a big difference.
Well, we're actually going to start to wrap up a bit, and I guess I wanted to give a couple of my reflections from what I heard, and then I have one final question for the panelists. So we spent a lot of time talking about data, how important it is to be accurate, to be traced all the way throughout the system, to be assurable. And then an awful lot of time talking about risks too. I think as we move into this brave new world, there is a lot of capacity for good and a lot of capacity to be able to fast track decarbonization, but there are a lot of risks with AI and different technologies. Blockchain made a reappearance, which I'm very excited about, and can't wait to see where that goes. And then just the idea that nature is decarbonization and that there's a social side of biodiversity. So we've moved away from talking about ESG these days. We can't use that acronym anymore, at least in the US. But I think we've touched on all of the components under the ESG pillars. And so I just wanted to wrap with that. But so as my final outgoing question. When I leave COP, I'm actually flying straight to Las Vegas for a meeting. And so, given that I'll be spending some time in the casinos, I wanted to ask my panelists if they had money to bet, where would they put it in terms of the future of AI technology and decarbonization?
Watch us all jump to go first.
Okay, I think the grid, the power grid, really needs to be upgraded to enable to adopt the renewables that is fluctuating, like solar and wind. So, and we need a lot more electricity. So put your money in the electrical grid.
Yeah, that's a pretty good bet. The electrical grid might have been mine. I might actually just go with the standardization for decarbonisation. I think we're wasting a lot of potential time and money and effort that we could be putting into, I don't know, making an impact on having to spend time doing the manual transformations and the work to mess about getting from different methodologies and across different data boundaries and so on. So if we just have a good data boundary, we can probably do a lot of work more efficiently.
I'd say people generally want to be more efficient, and I'm going to stick on that theme, to enable better reporting in an automated way to help generate that, but also audit it. I think there's a lot of time and effort, and ideally we can spend that exactly on what you said, doing the real work.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel for this really exciting and interesting conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I hope that you did too.